Professor Kennedy has written 4 books: Interracial Intimacies, Sex, Marriage.
The invitation to be here. It's wonderful to be back. And I had a wonderful time as a student here. There are many very fond memories. I'm very pleased to see friends and colleagues. And tribal feelings have not been my main reason for supporting Obama, but it's been roiling underneath. There's going to be a brother in the White House. Yeah, and I feel it too. That person did not say that he voted for Obama solely on the basis of racial loyalty. Indeed, he proceeds to say that his messy tribal feeling of racial affinity was not his main reason for supporting Obama. He cited Obama's brilliance, perspectives, and priorities. But this voter did expressly cite feelings of racial loyalty, kinship, and solidarity, because it reflects and nourishes the unreflected racialism, the lackadaisical chauvinism, the complacent racial narcissism that has long befouled American political culture. So what if a candidate looks like you racially? That is no positive attribute that you get.
I guess
Where I do, absolutely. So again, I said McWhorter didn't say that he was voting for Obama solely. In fact, that solely, people use the solely all the time. Very few people make decisions solely on the basis of race. Mark Furman, the infamous Mark Furman, nobody acts that way. It's almost always a mixed bag of things. So I'm arguing, I'm not just attacking the person who's acting on the basis solely of race. That's almost a null set, or it's a very marginal set. I'm attacking using racial loyalty at all. It should not be at all part of the electoral calculus. Let me make that clear.
What is surfaced when black people chose Muhammad Ali or Sonny Liston. In other words, really understanding a relatively unexamined subset of histories and feelings along a timeline. Both received histories of understanding the stakes of racial loyalty, what animates that racial loyalty, the life or death of racial loyalty, serious, really serious stuff, and then how we sort of figure that in the present moment looking forward.
I would embrace your call for such study. One of the reasons why I think there is not more such study is because people have been swayed by the such lines as black people can't be racist. I think that there is a tendency actually to avoid such explorations of the sort that you were mentioning, because people to actually go into it means to hold black people accountable and to take them seriously. And I think that in an ironic way, there's in some precincts there's an unwillingness to do that. Now, to use the examples that you gave, I think that they are very relevant in ironic ways. You mentioned Bobby Rush and Barack Obama. Of course, Barack Obama is I'm a big Barack Obama fan. He's been shown to be a very lucky person. One of the luckiest things that ever happened to Barack Obama was him losing to Bobby Rush. Why did he lose to Bobby Rush? One of the reasons that he lost to Bobby Rush was because racial loyalism. Bobby Rush was viewed as more black, more loyal, more racially dependable. There's another example of racial loyalism at work. It seems to me in a way that maybe should suggest that one ought to question it. It has to do with one of the most influential alums of Yale Law School, one Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. Without racial loyalism, Associate Justice Clarence Thomas would probably not be on the Supreme Court right now. It was racial loyalism that really came to his great aid in his great moment of distress.
Although without white opportunism and there would be no opportunity for that kind of thing.
There's many.
That's the bigger engine, I think.
There might be. I'm not. There you know, there are many things to study and to talk about, and you know, white opportunism, white racial narcissism, white racism. There's you know, a whole panoply of things, but among the panoply of things that, you know, it seems to me warrants discussion is how should black people feel and act and think about things? You know, and I think actually increasingly that's going to be an increasingly salient point, because increasingly, of course, fortunately, African Americans becoming, you know, increasingly more powerful. You know, the most influential person in the United States of America, indeed in the world today, is an African American.
Well, it's so terribly interesting, and because I like to talk. But no, there is something else. There's a missing subtext here, which is also, in a sense, missing in the paper. You focus on these outlier voters. I think there are outliers who, from race, was a significant part of their decision to vote for Obama. I think we also need to talk about the 88% of black people always vote Democratic. I mean, this is a fascinating question, and it's not ideology, because depending on how you slice it, if you look at economic issues and views on that, the African American community is very close to the core of the Democratic Party. On almost everything else is very far away. Plus, by and large, the condition of African Americans as measured in data does not get better under Democratic presidents. It either stays the same or gets worse. That's been the case since Lyndon Johnson went out of office. Since that time, it's been haven't made progress. Usually gotten worse on almost everything that you can measure, and yet we go on year after year voting Democratic. So it's not the outliers are really interesting, but the people whose votes are always there are also interesting, and as a matter of in a bizarre way, you can explain the result something like this: because black people always vote Democratic, 80 to 89%. There's no particular reason to give them anything in Democratic politics, because they're going to vote Democratic no matter what. Their votes aren't going anywhere. It's not a well-organized interest group, and in consequence, there's no particular reason to take seriously any particular set of programmatic concerns. So I mention that only as, not as saying people ought to vote some other way, but it's just striking me that this question about these people at the margin who changed their mind, in fact, or became more enthusiastic or more likely to turn out because of racial loyalty, is one question about politics. But there's another question about politics. I realize not what you're writing about. There's another question about politics, which is why we do this, vote in this block in the first place. But I know it's for another day.
Somebody looking at somebody and saying, he's like me, he's on my team. I'm from Texas. If a Texan is running, and if he is against me on enough issues, then I'm going to change my mind. But I'll probably still wish him well. I mean, so it seems like there are a whole lot of other axes on which
there's nothing that I can't coerce people. And it's, I mean, people can vote the way they want. People could, people could say, I'm going to vote for who I think is going to perform worst. There's nothing you can do about it. But there is the court of public opinion, and I think that the court of public opinion is actually influential and significant. You started off, you mentioned Texas. You said, I'm a Texan. I'm going to give it, my co-Texan. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. There are lots of things. I mean, we all have all sorts of rings of identity around us: religious rings, ideological rings, sections. I'm a New Yorker. You're a New Yorker. You're a Texan. I'm a Texan. Not all social demarcations are the same. There's a reason why we have a whole set of laws that aim at racial discrimination, as opposed to a wide variety of other discriminations. People can discriminate. I'm a higher so-and-so. Why? I'm a higher so-and-so because so-and-so is my third cousin. that's, no law against that. And then, people wouldn't, and nobody would be up in arms about that if they heard me say that. I'm going to hire so-and-so because so-and-so is of a given race. Or not of a given race. Well, then we all sorts of laws start kicking in. The racial boundary is a very special boundary in American life, law, and morals. And so it's not the same as, the other identifiers that mark everyone. And finally, on the question of teams, we have some say over what our teams are. I mean, it seems to me it's a mistake to think that the teams that we've inherited are the ones that we have to have. Even he looks like me. Well, he looks like, he has a head. I mean, the whole question of how people look is a function of how we've been socialized. If we could change that, we could change that in such a way that, now a person with a certain physiognomy might say about Barack Obama, he looks like me. But if we change things, that might, we could have the so-called white person who looks at Barack Obama and he looks like me. Or he is like me. So, one thing that's at play here is, what sort of community do we want? What sort of community do we want? Do we want the community that we've inherited, that has, in fact, racial teams? When I was a kid I'm from South Carolina. I used to spend my summers in South Carolina. And I'll tell you, when I was in South Carolina as a kid, I actually thought that the world was divided into two teams. I remember it vividly. I thought that there was a white team and a black team. That's the way I was socialized. And, you could be socialized in a very different way. And one of the things I'm talking about here is, in what way do we want to socialize people? How do we want the young person to think about voting? Do we want the person to say, I take a bunch of different things into account, but one of the things I take into account is I have a racial affinity with this person. My question is, do we want people to think and feel that way?
Close to that, in the sense that it's not clear that they'll take much into account. That's part of the problem. That is, people, whatever reason, there's a great difficulty in expressing and even perhaps feeling a level of democratic complexity. And so taking race into account as one of many, many factors is very attractive in a world in which we really believe people take lots and lots of factors into account. I'm just not sure they do, but I said I'll take less than 1 minute.
They are watching us. Yeah, I have an anxiety about that, and I don't apologize for it at all. And if I were, in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson begins by talking about the importance of, mankind. Mankind is watching. I don't think there's what's wrong with being attentive to the way in which people, one's fellows views one. That's very important. And if one's reputation, the way in which people view you, either individually or collectively, it's extremely important. And yeah, I'm very attentive to that. And I don't see, there's nothing, as far as I'm concerned, milquetoasty about it, or Thomish about it, or servile about it. It seems to me that that's perfectly prudent and fine. I talk about everybody. Most of the, I'd say most of the book, or not a lot of it, not most of it. I'm certainly talk about white people and all other peoples and ask, what's going on? What are the demographics? What are the sentiments? How should one feel about the dynamics? I'm not saying that, I'm not making a claim that African Americans should be especially conscientious. Everything that I say with respect to African Americans, I'd say with respect to anybody else. I think that we should all be very conscientious in the way in which we deploy a power that influences the future of the world. Finally, on the taking race into account, one of the, and do people take race into account? How do people take race into account? One of the characters, one of the most vivid stories from the last election that I recall was a story that appeared in the Washington Post, in which a Post reporter goes to someplace in Virginia, knocks on the door, and says, who y'all voting for? The lady of the house turns to her husband who's in the back of the house and says, who are we voting for? And the man says, tell him we're voting for the nigger. And the reporter says, explain that why. And the guy said, well, the economy is terrible and there's this war and blah, blah, blah. And one of the things I thought was sort of interesting about this, and I'm not applauding these people at all. It was an illustration, a very vivid illustration of people's taking a variety of things into account. And it was also a vivid illustration of the fact, and I do think it's a social fact, that Obama had to overcome his race in order to win. It wasn't the case that, then there were some people, obviously, who were very happy to vote for Obama in part because he was black. So he did get there were some people who viewed it as a plus. There were a whole lot of people, at least some, who voted for him despite his race. And it seems to me that's a very important thing, since in some precincts people want to, claim that we have overcome. Could I just take one on the question of, I'd like to pass the baton. My colleague Akil Amar is back there. Interesting, I don't know really what to make of that person. I will say something about guilt. People make guilt into such a bad word. Guilt's it's a civilizing feeling. I don't understand why people are so down on guilt. The problem is people don't feel guilty enough. No, it's true. This sort of, the guilty white liberal. Too few. Guilt's a very civilizing feeling. We don't have nearly enough of it, and it shouldn't be made into the curse. We shouldn't allow it to be stigmatized in the way it has been stigmatized. On the counterbalance, so this is your second point. I've talked in conversation with people who say, listen, Kennedy, you're preaching unilateral disarmament here. Other teams going to be organizing and marching and everything, and you're dilly-dallying around, being utopian. So here's my response to that. I don't think I'm being utopian. I think that if anything that can be done by the deployment of racial narcissism can be done, and done better, by a very different sort of appeal. So here, I'll go back to Obama. Obama this past summer spoke at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And in talking about the NAACP on on the occasion of its 100th anniversary, he made reference to its origins. The National Association, not of colored people. It's not the National Association of Colored People, it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an association that's always been multiracial. There were people of, in fact, in its origins, predominantly white, who organized to advance the struggle for racial justice. Not just the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. My favorite group, at least in the second half of the 20th century, would be the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which at its best was a multiracial group aimed and organized for the achievement of racial justice, open to all, focused for a particular fight, mainly in the American South, mainly having to do with African Americans, but its ultimate goal was racial justice. I put the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I put the NAACP up against any group in American history with respect to the fight for racial justice. And I would say those two groups, I would say, you show me groups that have done better for the advancement of black folk. Show me groups that have done better than those two groups. So I don't think I'm preaching unilateral disarmament. I think we simply have to be attentive. What can we do to fight for the good? Not for the black necessarily. I think it's a mistake to think that the good will always be black. No, not necessarily. Black folks, black organization might be doing good, might not. I have to know more than that. We should be about doing good. We should be about social justice. We should be about racial justice. If the advancement of a group, the advancement of a group is doing that, fine, and everybody come on board. But simply because it's black, simply because it claims that it's advancing the black agenda, hell, the black agenda might be putting its foot on somebody else's neck. And if the black agenda is doing that, then I'm not in it.
Wants credit for being guilty, for feeling guilty. Wants to take all the benefits that everyone else gets, but don't hate me for minutes, because I have the right set of emotions attending them. If somebody else doesn't have the right set of emotions attending them. And while that's very polemical for my taste, and I suspect for your taste as well, I do worry about the extent to which people may have thought some here white people voting for Obama was a way of expunging guilt. Now I don't need to feel guilty anymore. I don't need to do anything particularly about what you just spoke of, racial justice, because look who the president is. Look what fine people like me in our beneficence have accomplished. We have given to the country and the world this wonderful African-American and African-American president, and therefore we're done. Now we can do the really important stuff. And I think, and this is personal for me, in a sense, that is, or this is the one issue I care about deeply, is racial justice and poverty. I can still remember being on a television talk show a few years ago, end of the year show on one of these networks, and there were all these good liberal people on. Each one was asked, what is the main issue facing America next year? And they had these various issues, the war, this was when Bush was still president, the war, climate change, and they get to me, and I say, racial injustice, the continuing fruits of past oppression, continuing racial injustice. And the people are furious. They're angry on the air, because that is a distraction, they say, from the really important issues that we've got to take care